So for popular authors on YouTube, there's a lot of videos saying where you should start with any particular author. Like Stephen King, who's one of my favorite authors, there's tons of videos of people giving their opinions on where you should start with his works. Same thing with Brandon Sanderson, same things with a lot of different authors. But the one author who doesn't really get these types of videos is my favorite author, George R.R. Martin. And that's simply because most people, 99% of people, are only aware of A Song of Ice and Fire, and they're not aware of all of the other books that George R.R. Martin wrote previous to that. And since he's my favorite author, and I've read most of his books at this point, I haven't read all of them, but I've read most of them, I feel comfortable giving people recommendations for other places to start with him besides A Song of Ice and Fire. Or if you've already read A Song of Ice and Fire, maybe you can check out some of his earlier works. So I'm not going to recommend his books that are a little harder to find because a lot of his short story collections are out of print, so you can only really find them if you search hard enough for them. I'm not going to recommend those. If you're interested in checking out some of his early works, like his short stories and novellas, there's no better place to start than with his Dream Songs, Volume 1 and 2. This basically takes a bunch of his best short stories and novellas that he's written in various genres like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, all of them. And I will say most of his best ones are in these two collections here. But his very first published work, his very first published book, came out in 1976. And if you're interested to see what he was writing like back then I recommend just trying A Song for Leah. And this is a first edition paperback copy. And I'm pretty sure you can get this copy more readily available. So for those who don't know, George R.R. Martin, way back in the 70s and 80s, wrote predominantly sci-fi and predominantly shorter fiction. And like I said, this is his very first published work. This is a very short collection of 10 stories. It's his first one, and honestly, it's one of his best, in my opinion, especially for his title story, A Song for Leah. It's the last one in here, and it's incredible. It's basically about these two people who travel to this different planet. They're both lovers and they're both telepaths. And so they have really a vivid reality of what each other are thinking and what they've gone through in the past and what they really believe. They truly know each other. And one thing that George, if you've read a lot of his stuff, one thing that you know that he loves to write about is collective consciousness. And there's these creatures on this planet that, like, when they die, they absorb themselves into this thing and their consciousness lives on, and they have like the memories of themselves along with the memories of everyone who's been in there. Hopefully that doesn't turn people off, but I just think that's really cool. Anyway, it's just a heartbreaking novella, and it's got great character work, and it's really honestly one of the best things he's ever written. And it also starts out with two of my favorite short stories by him, and quite possibly my two favorite short stories ever, with Morning Comes Mistfall and The Second Kind of Loneliness. I've read these short stories probably like 4 or 5 times each, and they're just so good. Please try this out. So one of the main novels that he's written that I actually haven't read is Windhaven, which is a standalone fantasy which came out in the early 80s, and he co-wrote it with Lisa Tuttle. It might not be a great idea to recommend a book that I haven't read, but if you're interested in trying out a fantasy work that's not A Song of Ice and Fire that he wrote a decade before, I would try out this, because I really don't know why I haven't read this, but I will be reading it this year, more than likely. I'm very excited. And I also just want to let people know that he is capable of, building and finishing a story Like this, it's like I said, it's a standalone, and it does have an ending, so he is capable of writing endings. Where is Winds of Winter? But now for a book that I have actually read and really enjoy is Fever Dream, which is his vampire novel. This also came out in the early 80s, and I love it. I also have 3 different copies. This is a newer copy. This is a very old paperback copy. And then I kind of have a floppy edition to go along with it. So when an author writes a vampire novel, they don't want to basically copy Dracula, right? So they always have to put their own spin on the vampire genre. And George R. R. Martin definitely does that here. I won't go into necessarily what those changes are because I think learning about them is such an interesting aspect to this book. But what I will say is that this takes place in the 1850s, I believe, in the South on the Mississippi River on a steamboat, or at least one of the storylines does. And the 2 main storylines you follow in this book, you get one of a steamboat captain who's slowly realizing that there are vampires, and the other one you get is of a really old vampire who has a plantation, and he is a great character as well. And the way those 2 storylines converge is great as well. I will say probably besides A Song of Ice and Fire, which is my all-time favorite fantasy series, this is probably my favorite novel he's ever written. It's really good, and I highly recommend it. And this next book I have to talk about is also one of my favorites, right up there with Fever Dream, and that would be his sci-fi book novel collection. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's called Tuf Voyaging, and that is kind of the cheesy 80s cover original, and then probably the copy that if you want to try it out, you'd probably get this one, which is a newer, floppier edition. This is a great book that I love to recommend to people who don't necessarily like George R. R. Martin's tone or grim darkiness in A Song of Ice and Fire. This is a great example of him writing in a much lighter, more playful tone, which I think is really interesting if you haven't read anything else besides A Song of Ice and Fire. And definitely when I first read this, that's what intrigued me about it the most, because it was almost like it was a different author. But essentially, it's about a guy named Haviland Tuf, and in the very first story, you figure out how he acquires this giant ecological spaceship that has the power to change ecosystems on planets. And I don't think that's a real spoiler to say that he does acquire it, because it's called Tuf Voyaging, and he's in all of the rest of the stories. And I think there's 7 stories in here, if I'm remembering correctly. The very first one, he acquires the ship, and finding out how he does is fantastic. And then in the 6 other stories, you follow him on different planets and him kind of affecting their ecosystems or their people in various ways, and I love it so much. Easily one of the most underrated sci-fi books I've ever read. For this next book, I would really only recommend this book to people who love sci-fi and kind of the philosophical studies you can have with science. And this book is actually his very first published novel, and it's called Dying of the Light. And this is like a cheesy 90s cover. I think the book originally came out in the late 70s, but this is an old copy from the 90s, and then this is kind of a different copy, and then I also have a floppy paperback edition. This book is great. It's not necessarily one of my favorites, and it's not necessarily his best. This is a great character study where you get a lot of different characters, but for a lot of this book, it's essentially a guy traveling to a planet, and he's basically trying to get back with his girlfriend. And along the way, you learn a lot about this dying planet that they're on, which is why it's called Dying of the Light. The planet is slowly drifting away from the sun, and pretty soon it's going to become inhabitable. So a lot of people from different planets have been throwing this kind of like year-long festival to like kind of like celebrate the end of it. And you basically learn a lot about different cultures and just a lot of different aspects to not only the world that they're on, but different worlds in general. It's also probably important to read a handful of short stories before diving into this book, because George R. R. Martin has sort of written in this what's called Thousand Worlds universe, and this book has a lot of references to different short stories that he's written. The Thousands World universe isn't necessarily very popular or very well known, so if you're interested in learning more about it and going more in depth about it, I highly recommend checking out the channel Preston Jacobs. He's read everything, and he goes very in depth about all of the stories he's written in, way more than I ever will. But also, if you're just interested in checking out the very first novel he's ever written and you're a hard sci-fi reader, then I highly recommend this book because it's great. Not necessarily one of my favorites, but still great. And for anyone who loves a nice blend of science fiction and horror, probably one of the best novellas he's ever written, in my opinion, is Nightflyers. And it was originally published in a short story collection called Nightflyers, which of course I have multiple copies of. Old 80s cover and a newer edition, which this is readily available. So if you're interested, you can either buy this one or you can get the illustrated edition of Nightflyers, which is also great. But the basic premise of Nightflyers is you've got a group of scientists going into space and they're searching for this giant alien unknown creature called the Volcran. And basically the lore behind the Volcran is that whenever this giant massive thing floats near a planet, the planet seems to gain certain abilities that are kind of unexplainable. And then when the creature leaves, those abilities kind of go away. And that kind of premise is pretty much summed up with the very first line of this story. When Jesus of Nazareth hung dying on his cross, the Volcran passed within a year of his agony, headed outward. Sort of implying that Jesus got his, so-called divine abilities because the Volcran was passing by Earth when that happened. And like I said, this follows a group of scientists who go out on this mission because there's kind of a rumor that the Volcran's going to be kind of nearby, and the scientists are going to go look for it. But essentially what the story kind of turns into is sort of a murder mystery set on a spaceship, which is incredible. Because you're trying to figure out, like, who is murdering everyone, why everyone seems to be dying, and the reveal for what exactly is going on is just batshit crazy. Another cool book that George wrote way back in the 80s, but now has kind of a cool illustrated edition to, is The Ice Dragon. This book has a lot of parallels to A Song of Ice and Fire, like the fact that this world that the story takes place in has elongated seasons, just like A Song of Ice and Fire. So a lot of people reading it now, they see those parallels and they're like, does this actually take place in Westeros? But anyway, it's a really cool and short, easy to get through story. And if you get the illustrated edition, it just has really beautiful drawings. Like, look at that dragon. This is another series and book that I personally haven't started yet, but I know a lot of people would potentially be interested in it because it's essentially World War II with different superheroes. And it is his Wildcard series. And for a lot of the books in this very long series, I think it now has like 30 books, he hasn't written all of the books. In fact, most of them he doesn't write. He gets other sci-fi and fantasy authors to write stories within these books, and he is the main editor of the series. I will read it eventually, but I will admit I'm not a huge like superhero fan, so I'm not necessarily very interested in it. But of course, it's my favorite author, so I will be reading it eventually. And I'll just mention this book at the end for anyone who's read, some of these books, or for in the future, if you check out his works and you're actually enjoying them, then this short story collection, I feel, is terrific. And it's probably my favorite short story collection by him, and it's called Portraits of His Children. Probably the best story or novella in here is called Unsound Variations, and it's essentially about a angry, disgruntled, time-traveling chess player. And that might sound weird and not interesting, but it's incredible. And it's an interesting story because if you've learned more about George R. R. Martin's past, one of the things he did for a living was that he was a chess tournament manager. It's about these group of people who were on this chess team, and one of them kind of is, like I said, he's very angry and disgruntled about something that's happened in the past, and he kind of weirdly invites all of these people that used to be his friends to his house for like a party, and you slowly start to realize that he found out an ability to time travel, and he kind of messed with everyone's lives in various ways. And I just thought that was a really cool concept. But there's also the title story, Portraits of His Children, which is very good. You got The Glass Flower, Closing Time, The Last Super Bowl, which is a very cool sci-fi story that involves football, and I love NFL, so I thought that story was pretty cool. Also, I'll quickly mention another one of my favorite short stories by him it's in this collection, and it's called Sand Kings, and I actually have a couple copies, but here's a cool copy of Sand Kings. It's actually one of his most awarded stories. It won a Nebula, it won a Hugo, it probably won a few more awards, but it's his most awarded story he's ever written. It's one of those stories that's probably better going into it not knowing a whole lot about it. All I will say is that it's a horror story about a kind of psychopath who acquires these foreign insects called Sand Kings. And what happens in this story as you progress along with it is awesome. So hopefully I gave you guys some good recommendations for my favorite author, George R. R. Martin. If I inspire some people or even just one person to go pick up something besides A Song of Ice and Fire, which is still my favorite series of all time. I love it so much. But if I can inspire one person to go out and try out his earlier stuff, whether it be Fever Dream, his really cool vampire novel, Tuf Voyaging, a really fun sci-fi book, or some of his horror books or stories like Nightflyers and Sand Kings, or just his short stories and novella collections in general. He's so good. He's so good, and I want more people to try out his older stuff. Anyway, what did you guys think of this video? Have any of you out there watching actually have read any of these books? If so, I implore you, what have you read? Did you like it? Did you not like it? I want to know. Please put it down in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.